Ivan, earlier you mentioned poetics. Could you, could you expand on that a little bit and how that can help us to understand the historical books?
Happy to.
Yeah.
Poetics, it comes from the Greek word poieo, from which we get poetry and poets, which means to do or to make. And so poetics is the study of how narrators and authors make their narrative, the techniques that they use to make their narrative. If you want a more formal definition, it would be, quote, this is from Walke, the study of the literary devices an author uses to construct his composition. So what then are some of the techniques that an author would use to construct their narrative and insert meaning into it? Because they want to teach theology. So how do they do it? So let's look at a few techniques that they use. What do you think? Should we?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. One of them is what we call a leitwort.
A light?
L-E-I-T-W-O-R-T. It's a fancy German word.
Okay.
It means leading word or keyword.
Okay.
Keyword. Authors will insert keywords into their text in order to tell you what the theme or the subject is about. And by paying attention to those keywords, you will understand what they're trying to point to and the message that they're trying to make. Let's give an example. If you look at the story from Genesis chapter 25 to 27, this is the story of Isaac, there is a key word that occurs with the aging Isaac. And that is the word game. Game, and its close companion, savory food. Okay. You will read that story, and this word will keep popping up. As Isaac grew older, he developed a taste for game. Now, the Hebrew word, you can translate it in a different way. You can translate it as, literally, it means bushmeat, okay? And it'll occur over and over again, and he'll say to Esau, please go and prepare me some game that I love so much, and I'll give you the blessing. And prepare a savory dish and so forth. And if you pay attention to that keyword, you'll learn something very important about Isaac, and that is, in his old age, Isaac has lost his taste for spiritual things, actually. And instead, he has replaced it with a taste for this game that Esau can provide. And as a result of that, he favors Esau like he should not, because clearly God had said through Rebekah and through the word that he gave her that Jacob was the bearer of the promise. But Isaac does not care about that anymore. He prefers Esau because Esau provides this game for him. So by keeping that light word in mind, you get a bit of picture as to what goes wrong with Isaac and the whole problem in that family. Isaac has developed a taste, he has become an addict to bushmeat. And Esau has become his supplier of that. And it to disastrous results in the family. Just tears that family apart because of that. Very, very sad how Isaac ends that way. So that's, for example, one example of a leitwort. If you want another example, it would be, if you read 1 Samuel 8, this is the passage where Samuel is describing to the people who have asked for a king, let me tell you what the king will be like. And let's see if our friends who are listening will get what this word might be. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s and so forth. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male servants and female servants, the best of your cattle and donkeys, he will take for his own use. Verse 17, he will take a tenth of your flocks and yourselves, in the proportion that belongs to God, he will take. Is there a key word in there?
It sounds like it.
Okay. This is what a tyrannical king will be like. He will be a taker, and not a giver, but a taker. He will take everything that his grubby little hands can come on. So that's the power of a keyword.
And is repetition how we find out what keywords are?
Yes, a key word will have to be repeated, because if it only occurs once, then you don't know. There's a very, very beautiful and important keyword. It only occurs twice, but it occurs in the life of Abraham. Let me see if I can get that. Get that text up.
Okay.
Abraham's whole life is lived between two commands to him. In the Hebrew, it sounds like lekha. Very difficult to translate. Basically, it's up and go. And he first hears that command when he's in chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abraham, "Up and go from your father's house, from your country, from your extended family, from your father's house." And Abraham does. The next time he hears it is in Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. "Up and go with your son and sacrifice him on the mountain that I will show you." And the only two times those verbs occur, up and go, occur in all of Genesis. And those two frame Abraham's life. In the first case, up and go from your past. Your father, your country, you give up your past for me. The second time, up and go with your son, you give up your future for me. And Abraham has to give up his past and his future and just trust God to live in between. And by understanding those key words, you get the whole understanding of how Abraham lived and how he was a man of faith. And he lived his whole life with God. So that's the power of a light word.
So there's buried treasure in the Bible. These insights.
Oh,
and we can
absolutely.
That's why we can study the Bible all our life, and we can still find new things, and these kinds of tools, I guess, like keywords, can help us understand.
Right.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you have some more?
Refrain. The authors will use a refrain, much like after a hymn or something like that, you'll have a chorus that's repeated. The authors will do the same thing. There's a very important refrain in the book of Judges. At the end, in the epilogue of the book of Judges, that goes from chapter 18 to 21, there's a key phrase that's repeated 4 times, one in a long version and one in a short version. And that refrain is, the long version goes something like, "In those days, there was no king in Israel, and each person did what was right in their own eyes." And you'll find that in Judges 17:6. And the longer version, you'll find it at the very end, the last verse of the book of Judges, 21-25. In between, you'll find the shorter version, Judges 18:1. "In those days, there was no king in Israel." And you'll find it in Judges chapter 19:1. "Now, in those days, there was no king in Israel." So you can see that's a repetition. And refrains are important because they are the way the author tells you the main point of this text. Okay, the main point of this narrative is to tell you that there was no king in Israel and it's anarchy. There's no king in Israel, and then he'll give you a story of some horrible event happening in Israel. There's no king in Israel, here's another story to depict what life is like now. And then after telling us all of these horrible stories, there are 3 horrible stories in the epilogue of Judges. He finally concludes it by saying, there was no king in Israel in those days, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So basically pounding you with the fact that the problem for Israel right now is they don't have a king. And we need a king who's going to come and straighten this nation out. Otherwise, it's going to be destroyed. So that's a refrain. And if you pay attention...
Which is important. I'm just thinking of, critics of the Bible.
Yes.
Are going to zero in on those horrible stories.
Yes.
Say, look what a horrible book the Bible is, and what it's, telling. Yeah. But those kinds of refrains are actually commenting on it's not endorsing those horrible events, but saying this is happening because of lawlessness and a lack of authority and order.
Oh yeah, the Bible reports the way things are. And the fact is we are fallen creatures, and we have the potential to act horribly. It's not God's fault. And so they will report it, and they'll say, well, but this is the reason why it happened to you, and this is how you should fix it.
So we've got keywords, we've got refrain is another clue that helps to interpret.
There is contrasting. They will contrast things. And in this case, what they do is they bring things that are different and side by side so that you can get the theological point. A good example of this would be David's when we look at Samuel, we'll see that David's life is divided basically into two parts. Once he becomes king, there are two parts to his kingship. David under blessing, when he's rising and doing well. And then, of course, when he reaches the pinnacle, he just crashes and burns. And that's the second part. And the author has put a refrain, contrasting statements at the summary of each of those periods of David's life. So after the good part, good David, he summarizes it in this way, 2 Samuel 8:15 to 18. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. Joab the son of Zeruiah was over the army, and Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was recorder. Zadok the son of Ahitub and Ahimelech the son of Abiathar were priests, and Zariah was secretary. Benaiah the son of Jehodiah was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. End of the good part of David. And then with that, he moves now into the decline of David. And at the end of that decline, in 2 Samuel 20, 23 to 26, this is what he says. Now Joab was over the whole army of Israel, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and Adoram was over the forced labor. That wasn't mentioned before. And Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was the recorder, and Shiva was scribe, and Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jairite was also a priest to David. He leaves out something very important. Where is the justice and righteousness that David administered, that he highlighted in the first account? That's contrasting, right? He's bringing these two things. Well, because after you commit adultery with another person's wife and kill their husband, it's very difficult to say you administer justice and righteousness through your kingdom. So he leaves that out to show you that David has fallen in this way. So that is contrasting.
Contrast.
A couple of others that we can look at.
So we've had keywords, we've had
refrain,
contrast.
and we have the contrasting. You can also see comparisons. Contrasting is two dissimilar things being put together to show you theology. You can also put similar things together to show theological points. So, for example, you have let me think of a good example of this. Well, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the two accounts of creation. In both cases, you have a creation account. But in the first one, there's a different order. God creates humans. He creates the whole creation, and then he creates humans last. In the second one, he creates humans first, and then the rest of the creation. And in the second one, he's very active in the creation. He forms it with his own hands and so forth. In the first one, it is by his word. And so by putting these two stories together, what he does is he gives you a fuller view of the picture. It's to create fullness and completeness. It's the reason why we have 4 gospel stories of Jesus. You put all 4 and you compare them, and you get a fuller account by putting them all 4 together and reading them comparatively. So that is comparison, which is another technique. Here's a very effective technique. It's called cause and effect. Cause and effect. One of the very important doctrines that the narrator wants to give you is what we call the deed-destiny nexus. And if people can get a hold of this, it will actually help them. And that is, every one of your actions will result in a certain destiny for you. And that your actions are actually connected to your destiny. Once we realize that, it really liberates us and gives us wisdom. To know that every one of my actions is going to bring about a certain destiny for me, either good or bad. So if I know that is the way God has arranged the universe, then I can plan my deeds in such a way that they will bring about good destinies and not evil destinies. And so the author wants to show that doctrine, and so that's one of the techniques that he uses. So for example, in Genesis 24, Jacob deceives his father Isaac by taking advantage of his blindness, the darkness of his sight. And what he does is he substitutes the younger son for the older son, right? He himself, the younger, for the older Esau. Well, in Genesis 29, Laban using the darkness, the literal darkness of night, deceives Jacob by substituting the older daughter for the younger. There is that ethical monotheism. As Jacob cheated his own father, taking advantage of his darkness, we might say metaphorical darkness, it is done to him by somebody even more cunning and crafty than him. And Jacob gets to feel what it's like to be cheated. That's cause and effect. The Pharaoh that started drowning the Hebrew babies in the Nile ends up having his chariots and his army drowned in the Red Sea the Red Sea by God, and so forth. You reap what you sow. David raped another man's wife. Well, maybe rape, we're not sure it was rape, but it was adultery, and then killed her husband. In other words, he ruined a family through sex and violence. David's own family will be ruined by sex and violence. And in fact, that's a very serious thing that David reaps. In the law, if you stole another man's sheep and it was found in your possession, you gave that sheep back and you paid with one of your own sheep because you had to be defrauded the way you tried to defraud them, 1 for 1. So you lost one, you gave back the sheep and you gave one of your sheep back.
So that you experienced what you had inflicted on that a loss of a sheep.
Exactly. If you took the other man's sheep and you killed it, then you had to pay back 4 times. That's in the law of Exodus, 4-4. You had to give 4 sheep back there. Well, that's exactly what David did. He took somebody else's sheep and he killed it. And he pays with 4 sheep of his own. 4 sons of his will die for his sin. The baby that's immediately born. Then the son Amnon, that rapes Tamar, whom Absalom kills, the half-brother. Absalom himself is killed by Joab, number 3. And then finally Adonijah is killed by Solomon. He loses 4 sons for that thing. And what is interesting is, in exactly the same place where David spied Bathsheba, the same balcony, and began that whole sordid episode, that is the exact same place where Absalom will pitch a tent and sleep with all of David's wives, on that very same balcony. You reap what you sow. Deed, destiny, nexus, cause and effect.
So those examples, I mean, there's a real correspondence between the event and the consequence. This is more of a technique, almost like overemphasizing the connection.
Right.
Is that correct? Because,
yes.
I mean, our consequences that we experience today aren't necessarily exactly the same as what, but the narrator is using that real connection to drive home a point.
Drive home a point.
Okay.
And see, the point of these stories is so that we can compare ourselves to them. Okay. So we read these stories and they're meant to shape us into the covenant people of God. Mm-hmm. And so by studying the stories of our ancestors, this is our family tree, as Paul says to the Corinthians, if you have been baptized in Christ, these are our forefathers. And so by learning the way God dealt with them, we learn, first of all, not to do the same things and to avoid them, and how God's plan of salvation moves through history and how he's a righteous and just God. Not everybody gets their comeuppance or gets their punishment in this life. Certainly Cain did not. But there is a resurrection and there is a final judgment, and some of them will be called to account then. But sometimes in history it works itself out. And we have plenty of examples of that, even in our history, where people do evil and then end up experiencing the evil that they did to others.
You got one more?
Yeah, let's do foreshadowing. This is where an author will say something to you earlier in the story, and you might even miss it, but later on it'll come up, and then you'll go, oh man, why didn't I see that? So for example, a good example of this is that passage I read, 1 Samuel 8, where we looked at it for the keyword take. He says this: he will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. So now the tyrannical king will want to announce himself, and he'll put these runners in front of the chariots to go announce his arrival. Okay, so you read the rest of the Bible, all through Samuel and 2 Samuel, and you get to 2 Samuel 15. And he'll just throw this in. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. And you go, where did I hear that before? Oh, that was way back Samuel when he talked about a tyrannical king. He will take his men and put them in front of his chariots to run it. Absalom is doing that. Absalom equals tyrannical king. He doesn't have to tell you Absalom is tyrannical king. By that association and taking that phrase and putting it on Absalom, you know. He's done before he starts.